along with the economic problems that they're storing up for themselves, they're trying to hide at the moment. Inflation is not quite out of control, but very uncomfortable for people. And with wages not rising as high, although there are certain amounts of wages rising because there's a shortage in personnel, it's almost like a Ponzi scheme. Sooner or later, it's going to collapse.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hanson, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Tim White, journalist, documentary maker and Ukraine specialist. Tim, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Now, there's a lot to talk about at the moment in terms of where we are from a kind of geopolitical point of view when it comes to the war in Ukraine, but just focusing on what we're seeing on the front line at the moment. We'll come on to Kursk in a moment, but focusing on what's happening in the east of Ukraine, what is your reading of what is happening currently?
Well, one tries to be positive for Ukraine, but really it's been pretty dire. And the worst thing is that nothing really appears to have been done to stop the situation for a long time. Particularly disappointed that no fallback positions have been identified. We keep hearing village after village, sometimes big towns being fought over. Vuhledar being the latest, that has now, it seems, been evacuated, completely overtaken by Russia. But where do they fall back to? Just the next town, the next village, and try to defend that and get pushed back again. Where is the big concrete defensive line, the thou shalt not pass at all costs? There just hasn't been one. And they've had 2 years now to start preparing something behind which nothing would pass. And I'm afraid it still isn't there. So it's an ongoing, permanent, it seems, or semi-permanent, yard by yard, metre by metre, kilometre by kilometre withdrawal of Ukraine from its own territory. I don't see any reason why that is going to stop in the near term. Maybe the Ukrainian general staff has been waiting for permission to use heavier weapons inside Russia, but they can use this stuff inside Ukraine now. So that doesn't alter the fact there that they are losing on the ground. But being positive, I think Russia is still in trouble. They've certainly got munitions and missile problems at the moment because of the recent hits in Russia that we'll no doubt talk about shortly. And I think that Ukraine is doing the best it can on the battlefield, and certainly its fighters are. But I think that some of the generals and some of the organization from above probably needs to take a stronger look at how things have gone slightly wrong in a couple of years.
I suppose the only other positive from Ukraine's point of view in terms of what's happening in the east is that Russia is still racking up an enormous casualty rate.
Exactly. And I think that, along with the economic problems that they're storing up for themselves, they're trying to hide at the moment. Inflation is not quite out of control, but very uncomfortable for people. And with wages not rising as high, although there are certain amounts of wages rising because there's a shortage in personnel, it's almost like a Ponzi scheme. Sooner or later, it's going to collapse. We saw in Afghanistan when the Soviet Union withdrew, how quickly things can collapse and how a whole system that looked like it would be with us forever. I remember growing up in times of the Soviet Union, and suddenly, almost overnight, it had gone. And Putin and his cronies know that that is never far away, and they're trying this delicate balancing act. And the anger of mothers, the anger of the corpses coming home, much as they try to hide them, will be one of those main pressures to bear. And of course, you can't train new staff as easily, which is why they tend to try to keep their main fighting brigades out of real harm until it really comes to it, and just throw in a load of conscripts and poorly trained, fairly new recruits. I mean, they've used up pretty much all the criminals they could, the nice meat from the prisons that originally Prigozhin provided, and that Russia's been trying to do themselves since then. But yeah, it's all this little by little, added to the sanctions that we as the West are imposing. If they are absolutely tightened up, because there have been far too many loopholes for so long, James, then that will bring further pressure to bear on society in Russia, which at the moment, is still not really affecting anyone in the major metropolises where the middle classes are, to a lesser extent Yekaterinburg, but particularly St. Petersburg and Moscow.
And that fear that Putin will have, he's always had it. He's always been paranoid to an extent, and you could argue with good reason about how quickly his power base could crumble. I mean, that probably explains why we've seen an increase in attacks on civilian infrastructure and civilian targets in Ukraine. Only yesterday, there was a hit on Kherson. I think 6 people were tragically killed. That probably speaks again to Putin's concern about his own position.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think maybe it's desperation, but I think it's certainly a feeling that of impunity. I think I wrote on my Twitter feed that they know they can get away with this. What's the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen is that Biden says, okay, you can use those weapons, and the British are given permission, as I think they actually already have been. Whether Ukraine's used the Storm Shadow or the French Scalp, I'm not sure yet. I don't believe so, but it will happen. I believe that Britain has permission. But that's the worst that can happen. And what's that going to do? Yeah, it'll hit a couple of bases. They'll maybe lose a few more planes, but we can just strike, say we, from Russia's thinking, we can just strike terror. And that's what will change Ukrainian minds, that this has gone on too long. Nothing's improving. We're just losing people. My house was destroyed. My parents' house was destroyed. Let's just make peace. And that's exactly the attitude that Putin wants. And if we allow that to happen, you won't get peace. You'll get a temporary ceasefire. Russia will restock, rearm, and will repeat the mistakes that we've made under Putin's rule in Georgia 2008, when we thought we had a peace that would last. After they went in, they effectively annexed 2 pieces of land. And of course, Crimea 2014, when so little was done by the Obama and Biden government. And then subsequently since then, when Trump was in charge. And here as well, we were on the signatories to the Budapest Memorandum, and David Cameron now admits that was a mistake, unlike Obama. And it's just repeatedly as doing nothing when Russia attacks. And it wasn't just Kherson, there's Zaporizhia now every single day. There were more injuries there yesterday, more people suffering in Kharkiv again this morning, a hit in the city and hits in the regions as well, which caused more injuries. It's just ongoing. Every single day, we're seeing tower blocks being hit by Russia's glide bombs, aerial bombs, if you prefer. And there's just no military targets at all. It's just pure terror.
I want to come on to what more the West could be doing to support Ukraine in a moment, Tim, but just talking about what's happening in Kursk currently, obviously the kind of one of the objectives of it was to try and divert Russian troops away from the front line to the Kursk Oblast. Doesn't really appear to have happened in any mass scale so far. I've heard some people describe the Kursk incursion as a tactical victory, but no more. How do you read it?
I would say a partial tactical victory. There was a lot of pressure building on Syrskyi, and he had to do something dramatic. That's the head of the Ukrainian armed forces. And he replaced a very popular figure in Zaluzhny. Syrskyi is actually Russian by birth, so there was a lot of distrust there, which is a little unfair, but baggage comes with you when there's a war, I'm afraid, and there's a lot of distrust on all sides. I would say he's and his predecessors are partly responsible for what I said earlier about not having very good defensive lines, which should have been done. And even under his short tenure, could have at least made a start and had something to defend at this point. Still nothing in that regard. The shambles in Kharkiv when the invasion came from Russia, the secondary invasion in the north, in the near the Vovchansk, as probably most people are understanding now, and the little villages around there. So the counter-invasion, as I said, partial success because it did withdraw some troops. The speed of the advance of the Russian troops inside Donetsk in the east definitely slowed down a little. But it was more noticeable, I think, from Vovchansk and northern Kharkiv region, where there was definitely a slowing down from artillery, from attacks, assaults by Russia. And Ukraine did manage partial success, and they've got quite a lot of media coverage when they recovered the aggregate plant there, one of the big factories, which was seen as a mini control quarter for Russia for a while. But even this morning in Vovchansk, I've learned that the front line is being pushed forward again by Russia and that Ukrainians are on the retreat again there. So we don't know what it would have been had the Kursk invasion not happened, counter-invasion. But even there as well, I think Ukraine is struggling to hold on to some of the gains. They were continuing to expand on one side, but lose territory on the other. I don't think there are any more gains going on now. And slowly, the Russians are regaining hamlets, villages, but there's still a significant amount of territory that is currently occupied by Ukraine. And of course, the other thing that has been mentioned by many is it's a bargaining chip, isn't it? And we are, sooner or later, the war will end one way or the other, and it will probably end with some sort of agreement, be it with Putin or his successor, how far the West is involved and whether any ground has to be conceded or not. And I really hope not, because that's rewarding terrorism and the breaching of all international rules. But having a small chunk of Russian land will certainly help Ukraine and show Russians that the war can actually reach them when they're sitting comfortably having their lattes in Moscow or St. Petersburg.
Let's talk about what more the West could be doing to support Ukraine at the moment. Obviously, we had the UN General Assembly last week. I mean, had we had this conversation 2 weeks ago, I would have thought it was looking as if the White House would approve the use of long range missiles, specifically the Storm Shadows and the Scout missiles, by Ukraine to hit targets inside Russia. That now doesn't appear to be the case. President Biden still apparently has concerns about escalation. I mean, from my point of view, Tim, I can't quite understand that. I think we've seen time and again how a lot of Putin's so called red lines are exposed as bluffs. Can you make any sense of it?
Cowardice. That's the only word I would use because time and again we've seen, unfortunately, I mean, it's a favourable administration in the fact that Biden and the Pentagon is supporting Ukraine massively. And you could well argue that Ukraine wouldn't have survived this long without that support. However, persistently, James, it's been just enough to stop Ukraine from going under. It's like throwing a life jacket, but then not rescuing the person who's flopping about on the waves, desperate for help. It's like throwing them a rubber ring, but not hauling them in, just leaving them there. Something needs to be done further. And as you say, each time, I mean, quite often Britain has led the way in this, right from javelins in the early days, from announcing the tanks, and yet still we've had very little leading support. Ukraine acknowledges the support that US has provided, and Biden talks about the US being the leader, but they're not first. They won't take that step, and there is no indication whatsoever that Russia has or will ever escalate things further than they are doing. They know they couldn't possibly survive if there was a marked increase. And it's not just Putin that would press the red button, and I don't think anyone else would be inclined to do that either, because they know there's going to be absolute obliteration. And you can't live in fear. You can't say, well, okay, then we'll give in just because you've got a red button. So have we, but we won't use it. So you're absolutely right. Now, coming to the missiles, as I said, I have been told that Britain will or has given permission. Now, it may be that Biden and the Pentagon have given permission as well. I doubt that, same as you, but they wouldn't make it public. That was what I was told from inside Ukraine, and that they would strike with hopefully an element of surprise. So it could be that Britain, when the visit was made, the first visit by Keir Starmer, he seems to have been there a lot recently, doesn't he? That it was fleshed out, that agreement was made, and that now, just a couple of weeks later, when it's died down a little, maybe some of the aircraft are being tentatively put back in within strike range. They're assessing with new satellite data exactly where to hit, and then hitting with a little bit of element of surprise. I hope so. That information, as far as I last checked, is still valid, that Britain is prepared, and I think the permission has been given. And the absurdity of the situation is, again, I've written about this a few times, that we're worried about escalation in the West, and that's completely understandable. But what we've got down to is Biden forbidding use of weapons that have American components to strike inside Russia or deep inside Russia. And yet, every single day, there are US components in the weapons that are coming back fired by Russia, whether they be made in Iran or North Korea or Russia itself. They have US components, they have British components. And that comes back to tightening up on the sanctions and having end user agreements and things like that, which I think have been really sorely lacking throughout, because putting sanctions on is one thing, but enforcing them is completely another. So how can you say, well, this missile's got American components in, so France, you can't use your scalp as you want, and yet almost the same components in many of the missiles and munitions that are landing on Ukrainian cities. There is no logic at all to the US position currently. And I think we have to look at the security advisor, Jake Sullivan. The response with Israel, I know it's a very close, lifelong partner and has a lot of votes attached to it in the US, is one thing. But to be almost completely indifferent to Ukraine under the same sort of circumstances beggars belief, really, when you're talking about being the world's policeman and ensuring a stable future, when Russia is every much a threat as Iran is to society in the USA and here in Britain as we're talking today.
It's a good point you raised about what's happening in the Middle East at the moment. And even though superficially it doesn't have that much to do with what's happening in Ukraine, it does, in the sense that the White House will be expending far more energy this week on what's happening in the Middle East than they are about Ukraine.
Yeah, that's the tactical gamble that was taken by Iran ordering Hezbollah. And if you think that Iran and Russia aren't talking, anyone watching us now, you're just completely mistaken. And I'm not an expert on Iran or Middle East affairs. I take a passing interest, obviously more than a passing interest in all news, all conflict. But I'm absolutely convinced that the 7th of October attacks Russia knew about in advance. It's incredible how quickly they've switched with quite a lot of Soviet Jewry and quite a lot of history between support for Israel and Russia to suddenly being so anti-Zionist, as they would say, and so anti-Israel and so pro-Palestinian and pro-Islamic fundamentalism also. It's ridiculous, including putting an arm around the Taliban. So it's purely political. Russia and Iran are now literally brothers in arms. They're hand in glove with each other. And a decision has been taken that, okay, we can have an escalation. We can make Hamas provoke Israel. We can then get Hezbollah involved. Yep, they can fire off the weapons. Right, okay, now let's have another sit down. Do we bomb America? Do we bomb Iran? And what will America do? Does Iran bomb Israel? And what will America do? Yep, let's go for it. And they've bombed. They're awaiting the response now. But two things that will happen is, one, there will be a continuing shortage of missiles being delivered to Russia, and they've already lost a lot in the recent hits. So good news for Ukraine, ostensibly. But the problem that we have in the West is that states like Jordan, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, more moderate Egyptians, peace deals that have been agreed previously, all these countries happy to work with the West, happy to allow access at some times. Now it comes down to a straight decision. Are you pro or against West? Are you pro or against your Islamic brothers? And that's exactly what Iran wanted. And it's what Russia has always tried, to divide people who are against them, to divide their enemies. They did it in the EU. They tried to do it with supporting Trump in the US. They probably, to some extent, were filtering money into the campaign to remove the UK from Europe, although there's a lot of contention about that. Obviously, we have to be careful what we say. But wherever there is some division, Russian money can usually be found, including Hungarian banks supporting right-wing in Spain has been revealed this week. And Hungary, of course, were absolutely adamant when sanctions were applied to one of their banks that had to be removed. Also links between Hungarian banks and Russia's money. It's just for years. I mean, Putin is a clever chap, and he's been for 25 years, first of all, very strategically building up this empire and eliminating all his opponents, first of all, be it jail or killing. And then, even some like Hodorkovsky being released is just a peripheral figure now, based in London as an exile with a small following. It just doesn't harm Putin. And then after that, infiltrating the West, Britain, US, other Western powers, naively thinking that Russia was friendly and would be friendly for the foreseeable future, and allowing, and we've done the same with China recently, as has been proven, allowing agents, sleeper agents or whatever, to be embedded in society. And with the mass misinformation and communications campaign that had been launched originally by Prigozhin when it first came to the international media, I think, with the factories in St. Petersburg of hundreds of people just piling out tweets and other social media messages that were pure fakes or disinformation, again, designed to cause this hatred, this division, to raise skepticism in the West. We're free thinkers. We have very few rules, whereas try and raise any of this in Russia or China, you'll be in jail before you know it. And that's if you get a good result, as has been proven time and again. So our freedoms have been exploited by Russia over a very, very long time. We're only now really reaping the rewards and realizing the damage that has been done at such an almost endemic level, I would say.
Yeah, just to pick up on that point about Russian disinformation being spread online and through other means, I know that's something you've done a lot of research into in the past, Tim. You've done documentaries about fake news. How is it affecting the war in Ukraine? What have we seen so far in the war in Ukraine when it comes to Russian disinformation?
Well, manifold, really. If you think about actually in Ukraine, then still the influence immediately before the war, or even before 2014, but the stoking up of trouble in 2014 in eastern regions of Ukraine that soon came under Russian control when the invasion happened, when they pretended it wasn't them invading, it was just local people angry with Ukraine. Um, Before that in Crimea as well. Now, there has always been a very strong link between Russia and Crimea, and I don't doubt that at all. I'm not disputing it. However, every single year, reputable agencies carried out opinion polls and gave the option: do you want to join Ukraine? Do you want to remain anonymous? Do you want to join Russia? And Russia never got near 50% in that vote. It was always retaining on autonomous status and be as things were. They were quite happy. The Russian fleet was allowed to stay in Ukraine, which was a huge tactical mistake, but at the time was seen as avoiding war and ameliorating Russia and keeping the peace, which it did arguably, but it put Russia in a much stronger position thereafter. Still, the disinformation goes on, the lies, the trying to say that Russian army is great and the Ukrainian army makes all these terrible war crimes, which is just the absolute opposite, polar opposite of what is really happening. They will still pay people, or maybe find a couple of people who genuinely believe it, to interview when they go into a town, saying, we're so glad you're here, and this sort of thing. And it's difficult because when Ukrainians go into a town where they liberated Kherson, we saw thousands and thousands and thousands of people on the streets welcoming the troops. And when you go into smaller places, smaller villages, obviously the crowds are fewer. It's very easy, if an army comes into your village, if you're living in a small village, and says, we need you to say this, and there's a gun at your head, what are you going to do? I mean, are you really that brave to say, no, go away, I don't want you, to use polite words, this is Ukrainian land? Very unlikely. And you can understand people being pressured, and old people at least being given a bowl of hot food maybe for the first time in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe a month, are more likely to be thankful to see anyone and think, oh, thank God, peace. Maybe now I can just live my life. And so these are the things that are amplified. We're pleased that we've been liberated when actually they're being occupied. And this is what's shown on TV at home. So when they show occasional, this poor old lady who was without food for 3 weeks, a lot more people in Russia, because this is amplified on every channel all the time, in the national newspapers all the time, and it's still very much old media, traditional media in Russia, then more and more people become annoyed because they think that Ukraine is full of Nazis, notwithstanding numerous facts that could dispute that for a start, but it clearly isn't. And Russia is acting as a fascist state these days, absolutely. And so you get more people volunteering to fight for Russia. You get more people donating. This helps the army, even though the spending is over a third now and heading towards 40%. In the West, it's causing divisions, which is they will pour money into extreme right, extreme left, anything. They've been seen to support Le Pen before, of course, to stoke division in France. Very close now to the top of any election, and with a real chance of taking power unless things change dramatically in France in the next 5 to 10 years. And in other nations as well. We've seen the rise of the right wing across Europe, in the Netherlands, in Germany most recently. And it's discontent with the government. And so anything that undermines a government is promoted by Russia. And it can be with social media posts posing as Germans or Poles or Dutch. It can be in the US posing as, we don't know who people are, because particularly on X, formerly Twitter, there's a whole lot of just absolute tripe that is published that no one is, and people with huge followings are just saying anything they want. I mean, we got to the stage last night in a vice presidential debate when one of the candidates complained because there was some moderation. You're not supposed to be fact checking. I mean, who goes into a debate and says that? But that kind of typifies this whole right-wing conspiracy in the US, but also elsewhere on the left and the right, that Russia has managed to make society this way for us at the moment. I mean, one thing I come back to is that, and I think, why does it happen? Why do so many people believe in conspiracy theories? Why do so many people believe the nonsense by Russia? When you're bombarded with it so often, you actually sometimes, I've doubted myself, is Ukraine telling the truth? And then I've gone back to research even further. Maybe there is a small grain of truth in what Russia is saying, and they're just enhancing it. And usually just none, zero, nothing at all. But the human mind, although when we meet someone, we believe what they say, if they then, as part of what they say, and the human mind is to believe people, come up with a conspiracy theory, we're inclined to actually believe them. And we do have investigative minds, all of us. When we're kids, we need to discover new things. We're trying to crawl off new places. People want to go on new places on holiday. The human instinct is to expand our knowledge. So that inquisitive mind, combined with someone just putting a seed of doubt in your mind about whatever it is, UFOs or a secret state existing, a deep state within the US, it gains traction fairly quickly. And in today's disparate society, it hasn't gained traction for hundreds of years or over 100 years since the invention of television, because mass media just checked the facts and it just wasn't relevant. It just wasn't true. Why would you put lies out? But when someone on social media can just put any sort of lies out and soon gain a following pushed by others of millions, then that's when it becomes a problem, because then people think, well, this guy's got millions of followers, or this girl, so therefore there must be some truth in it, what they're saying. And they think, well, even we see, how is Trump anyway near in the opinion polls when there is such obvious holes in most or many of his arguments? And I think it's because of that. I think people think, well, everyone lies, and yeah, he's lied about a few things, but on these important matters, this is what I agree with. And I think that's what has happened so much, that our disinformation is so prevalent in society now that we just think it's a normal. We just think we're intelligent enough to just pick the bits that are relevant to us. But in effect, that's kind of like just the echo chamber, isn't it? Because you just listen to what you believe in or what you don't believe in. And it is causing problems at a societal level across civilized societies. No such problems, of course, in Russia or China or other authoritarian states. And it's a weakness of democracy, but it's something we've got to try and find the final answer to.
And just finally, Tim, on the topic of what more the West can be doing, I mean, it strikes me that we don't know the finer details of Zelensky's victory plan, but one of the planks we understand is about this consistency of military aid, that it's been very stop-start, it's been very feast or famine, and that if Ukraine is going to win, it needs a consistent level of military aid. How much do you think that is crucial? And also, is there more that Ukraine's European allies could be doing? And I don't mean to single them out, but particularly France. If you look at the amount of military aid France have provided, it's about a third of what the UK and Germany have.
It is. And also, don't forget, UK does a lot of training, which doesn't have a figure put on it. So quite often the Germans will say, well, we're supplying all this, we're number one. But a lot of the training, a lot of the aid and specialist aid in that regard comes from the UK. So don't ever underestimate that. But as you say, France is way down. And again, kind of comes back to the democracy thing, doesn't it? Elections, and France scared to upset anyone, trying not to lose a few borderline right-wing votes maybe, and possibly the same is happening in the US now. Is the US just waiting? A lot of people told me, well, it's obvious they're just waiting until after the election, then in November, if they've won, the floodgates will open, there'll be no restrictions. I can't guarantee that at all. Should the West be doing more, particularly Europe? Yeah, obviously, I think so. I think, firstly, if we've got the sanctions, we certainly have to make sure that items, whether they be luxury goods, the Skylight highlighted the other day, whether, as Times and TimesRadio has reported, components going out to third-party countries, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, even Turkey, and making their way to Russia. End-user agreements have to be put in place, and huge fines and potentially jail sentences for directors who are known to be allowing that have to be put in place. The whole thing has to be completely rewritten because the laws are not strong enough at the moment in any of the EU nations. Talking about the long-term aid for Ukraine, then I think that's been termed off the record, at least until after the meeting in New York, as Trump-proofing, because there is obviously that real fear that if it's not written in a statute that can't be overturned, then it'll just dry up almost overnight. And certainly, I don't think anyone expects Trump to try to continue the war. But yeah, the EU could be doing more. There's a huge disparity, not just with France near the bottom of the list, but with the nations at the top. Look at them as a percentage of GDP. Why? Because they're next to Russia, because they've previously been occupied, because they see the danger and they see that having 3.5% of GDP is nothing compared to the loss materially, but also in human life, freedom, liberty. It is priceless. How much do we want to pay? Are we really going to struggle at a few more tenths of percentage points on GDP as a nation to stop the next war, to stop Russia's further advance? Because it will happen. And why are we not learning from history? We did nothing in 2008, Georgia, nothing in 2014. And while Putin's there, and even if Putin is removed at the moment, there is no potential chance of a moderate successor coming. My best hope is that someone who's looked like a complete idiot, like Medvedev so far, will see if he somehow manages to get to the top, which I very much doubt. I've just picked one of the names out there that people might know a little bit more, former president. If he has some sort of real authority, he may then see the benefit of negotiations and slowly passing off what Putin did as many mistakes, revealing the true death toll and managing to slowly change public opinion. Well, one thing I do want to mention before we go is education. Much as people hate Russia at the moment, look at what happened between the First and Second World Wars. You cannot punish an entire nation more than should happen. And then you will just cause that rise of nationalism, resentment, hatred. We still never really resolved what happened in Serbia in terms of education. And most Serbs still think that NATO is a heinous, horrible conglomeration that unjustly bombed Belgrade, forgetting about Srebrenica and other massacres. It comes down to education in our own countries to try to make people aware of what is fake news, what isn't fake news, but also education for people in Russia at some future point and in everyone else who is sympathetic to Russia.
Tim, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today.
James.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.